Hello everyone. Just checking it's gone live. Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight to Assembly Online. Michelle Williams, looking forward to tonight's event. Anna Lucas. Hello everyone. Oh, just checking that was my fault with the audio, sorry. Jane Hill is here. At Teresa Grimes' invitation, with thanks. Sylvia Wilde has a glass of wine ready. Susan and Andrew are tuned in from Norwich. Alan Cameron with Maggie, both waiting. Sarah Masson, Emily Anderson, Anna Lucas. Thank you all for tuning in. Says there's no volume at present. Hopefully the volume's coming through now, Jane. It's on about a 30-second delay, but hopefully, could someone confirm there's volume on the YouTube channel? Jane's put in the comment there's not any. Well, I'll carry on and hope there is. Tonight, as I'm sure you know, is an oven by event for the Norwich Women's Film Weekend. This is an event organised by Jonathan P. Watts, who runs a series of talks, discussions and screenings. Hello, James Epps, just tuned in. Could someone in the chat confirm that there's audio? Okay, someone just texted me to say that you can hear me. Thank you. Okay, so great, everyone can hear me. Just a slight worry there. I'll be back at the end to talk more about the upcoming programme that we have. We've got events booked in now till the end of November. Lots of really exciting things happening. There's quite a lot going on tonight with the presentation and discussion, and I'll let Jonathan do an introduction now. I'll be back at the end, but glad that the audio is working in N5.
Good evening. Hopefully you can hear me on your end. My name is Jonathan. I'm an art writer and an occasional curator based in Norwich. I'm also the programmer of and By, which, as Henry has suggested, is an ongoing series of artist talks, screenings and conversations hosted by the Assembly House Trust in Norwich. and By is part of the wider programme of contemporary art and activity overseen by the Trust's visual arts coordinator, Henry, who you've just met. The programme and By, it doesn't have a thematic design as such. In other words, it's not tightly programmed to develop a set of themes, but what coheres the programme, however loosely, is that the work presented has some association with East Anglia. At the last event on the 9th of July, we welcomed Justin Barton, who presented the audio essay on Vanishing Land, which was produced in 2006 in collaboration with the late Mark Fisher. Justin joined me afterwards in conversation and to take questions from the viewers, because of course the audience is now viewers at home. Prior to this event with Justin, we've welcomed filmmakers such as Louis Henderson and Emily Richardson, and also the collage artist Simeon Barclay. After tonight, the next and By will be on the 12th of November, which is a date for the diary. But to come to tonight, really we're privileged to be joined by the Cine Women group, Elizabeth B, Biddy Fisher, Teresa Grimes, Caroline Merz and Ginette Vincendeau, the force really behind Norwich Women's Film Weekend. Norwich Women's Film Weekend was a two-day event that ran for 10 years at Cinema City in Norwich from 1979 to 1989. And in addition, Cine Women offered film and television training courses for women. I first heard of the Film Weekend when Teresa told me about it in 2018 at an exhibition opening at Tintype, which is the gallery that Teresa runs on Essex Road in North London. I personally am really fascinated to learn about and to celebrate and share the city's legacy of more radical experimental cultural and artistic activity, often which is overlooked. I think that these examples can be instructive. They can instruct us how to work together and also how to self-organize. Teresa subsequently introduced me to Ginette Vincendeau, who, as she told me, was instrumental in getting the weekend started and really establishing its reputation. When I contacted Ginette's immediate response to the invitation was to gather the Cine women together. And in what follows, I'm not going to say a great deal about the weekend precisely because we have all of them here this evening. Of course, it's unlikely that we'd have been able to have coordinated a gathering like this in normal circumstances, IRL, in real life. Communications technology and internet streaming, which we see increasingly relied upon during the lockdown, has meant that we've been able to arrange 5 voices to give an account that is really textured. There is a theme that's emerged in thinking about this event, and it is memory. And memory, of course, is fallible, whether we're thinking of institutional memory or individual memory. And aside from Caroline Merz's chapter about the weekend in this BFI title, Films for Women, edited by Charlotte Brunsden in 1986, there is no scholarly record of the events that took place. At the most superficial and yet ubiquitous level, there are no results that come back in a Google search when we look up Norwich Women's Film Weekend. Even though, as Ginette recalls, each year, and I'm quoting, we produced a poster, a programme and a booklet, and we wrote articles in the Cinema City magazine First Cut. No archive holds documentation of the weekends. So the weekend began out of a shared love of cinema and was informed by developments in the women's movement. It recognised the ways that women had been discouraged historically from producing film, but also sidelined from historical accounts. It seemed to recognise and understand the cinema as a technology that reproduces images and ideas of women, and also cinema as a technology for re-examining earlier cinematic representations of women. Access to was enabled in the over the weekends by the availability of affordable food, of affordable accommodation and facilities, including a creche. In Caroline's presentation that follows, Caroline talks of the idea of rediscovery, that filmmakers who were celebrated at the Norwich Women's Film Weekend have subsequently been rediscovered and claimed by subsequent generations. And she reflects on the way that this process of periodic rediscovery could be disheartening. But I feel that, we have to keep talking about it, that forgetting is a kind of active practice that generates simplified narratives and at worst erases them. Tonight then might feel like a rediscovery of sorts, but I hope it's an opportunity to continue the conversation. Tonight, in the order of presentations, we are joined by the following in this order. And I just would point you to the full biographies in the description underneath the streaming image at the moment. You can read the full biographies there. But tonight, the order of presentation is Ginette Vincendeau to start, Biddy and Elizabeth together, Elizabeth B., Caroline Merz and Teresa Grimes. The presentations in total will last approximately 50 minutes. And what will follow will be around 30 minutes for questions and conversations. You can ask questions by writing in the chat, which is to the right of the screen, and I'll keep an eye on that. And if you have questions as you're watching, then just type them in the chat and I'll return to them at the end when we open up to the floor. I should just say that this event will be documented, and you will be able to retrieve it and view it on YouTube. So I would encourage you to share it with people that might be interested in learning more about this really unique event. So I will now hand over to Ginette, and it's a pleasure to have you all this evening, and I would just like to take the opportunity to thank you for taking the time to work on this. It's a great pleasure.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. So my name is Ginette Vincendeau, and I begin tonight's discussion of the Norwich Women's Film Weekend, partly because I was there at the beginning, but my senior women friends will carry on after me. First, I wanted to thank Jonathan and Henry for inviting us tonight, because this invitation has made us realize that while the event is vivid in our memories, it hasn't left much of a trace in the media. And we hope very much that tonight's event will change that. As Jonathan mentioned, apart from Caroline Mertz's chapter in a book called Films for Women, edited by Charles Bransdon in 1986, there is no scholarly record of the weekend. And we discovered that when Jonathan invited us. Although each year we produce a poster, a program, a booklet, and we wrote articles in First Cut, no archive holds any of this documentation. So tonight is a great opportunity to reclaim this history of an event that was important to us at the time, but which also forms part of the history of women's cinema and feminism more generally, and also the history of Norwich. So thanks also, Jonathan and Henry, because in the process, a group of friends called Cine Women, several of whom are on this photograph. Of course, we haven't changed at all, as you'll be able to see tonight. So this group of women has been able to continue a long-standing dialogue. We were friends then, and we are still friends 40 years later, even though life and geographical distance have in some cases loosened the links. So I will begin tonight's conversation because I initiated the event way back in the late 1970s, but my fellow CILIP women will pick up the thread. And indeed, the first thing I want to say is that none of it would have been possible on my own. The Norwich Women's Film Weekend was very much teamwork for practical reasons, as we'll hear, for reasons of friendship and for reasons that have to do with women's struggles. So back in the late 1970s, I was living in Norwich, teaching French in schools and then at UEA, the University of East Anglia. And my interest, however, was in the cinema. I began a PhD in film around that time. And I want to mention here that UEA was one of the first universities in the UK to develop film studies, and in particular with Thomas Elsasser and Charles Barr. And at the time, through a friend, Keith Roberts, I joined other volunteers at the Council of Management of what was then called the Norfolk and Norwich Film Theatre, which became Cinema City in April 1978. Like others on the Council of Management, I worked as a duty manager one evening a week. And this is how I met Biddy, who was usher on the same night. We became friends. And then with Teresa Grimes and Caroline Merz and Elizabeth B., we formed Cine Women. Now, meanwhile, at the Council of Management, we would discuss the program on a regular basis and make suggestions. Apart from French and European cinema, I was passionate about women's films. This was the time of a fantastic explosion of feminist work. In 1978, I organized at Cinema City an event called Women in Film, which encountered a little bit of resistance. The Council of Management was mostly male at the time, although there was one other woman called Brenda Ferris, who then became mayor of Norwich. And I remember a few sniggers at the mention of something to do with women. However, feminist events and women's cinema were really making an impact at the time. And to be fair, the council supported the event. I think that women in film, so the 1978 event, must have done well, so that my suggestion of a regular event around women's films was agreed. At the time, Cinema City was sponsored by the BFI, the British Film Institute, and they advised me to talk to the feminist theoretician and filmmaker Laura Mulvey, author then of the groundbreaking article Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, published in 1975, which defined the notion of the male gaze in film. Laura had also taken part in the first women's film event in the UK at the Edinburgh Festival in 1972. I remember being nervous when I went up to London to meet the famous Laura Mulvey. I also had a memory of a screening of her film, Riddles of the Sphinx, as it happens, which was at the Assembly Room in 1977, I mean, in the actual Assembly Rooms. Now, Riddles of the Sphinx was a difficult film, a difficult avant-garde film, and Laura, I remember, had to face hostile questions. However, she remained graceful, making no excuses for her commitment to women's issues or her avant-garde film practice, and that was a real inspiration for me. Laura also turned out to be extremely nice and supportive, and later I translated Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema into French, and we're still friends today. She gave very useful advice, and especially the confidence for us to forge ahead and for Cine Women to organize the event. In retrospect, it was quite an accomplishment, considering that none of us had much experience of organizing or curating an event on this scale. Reflecting on the Women's Film Weekend today, to me, brings back all at once the excitement, the stress, the hard work, and the fun of it. Meeting the filmmakers, seeing the audience pour in, taking part in heated debates, and especially discovering a huge range of films. As I said, the 1970s was a fantastic period for feminist film theory, but it was also the moment when women's cinema really took off. And our event, I think, bears the mark of this dual heritage. I want to end up this brief presentation with a few thoughts on the first event in 1979 in particular, because it really put in place the main lines that we would develop over the years. And my friends will then speak to other aspects of our joint venture. So looking again at the impressive range of material that we managed to cram into 2 days, three main things strike me. The first one is the examination of images of women. We showed a huge range of films, from German art cinema to British war documentaries and Cuban political film. But one major theme that we could see running through everything was the need for more realistic images of women. Cinema screens had been dominated by women as romantic figures or sex objects, and women filmmakers saw it as their mission to portray the reality of women's lives, and they embroidered on the feminist theme of the personal is political, with an accent on work, motherhood, sexuality, and reclaiming the place of women in history. In that first year, we had a very strong German presence, reflecting the German women's feminist political militancy. In the following years, we continued to show a great work by German women, but also by a lot of French women, from the pioneer Alice Guy to Catherine Breillat, for instance, who came in 1999 and gave a very animated Q&A for her controversial film Virgin. And then looking at the program today, I see that we were very cautious, and we wrote that, quote, she had been invited to speak about her film, as we thought at the time that we could never get somebody like Catherine Breillat to come to Norwich. But to our surprise, she did come. Secondly, the second major theme is that we showed a very distinctly militant brand of cinema, which placed feminist struggles explicitly within the class struggle, with films like Night Cleaners, still celebrated as a landmark of collective and feminist filmmaking, I see on the British Library website. And sexual politics, as in the lesbian film Comedy in 6 Unnatural Acts, which we showed and which today is recognized as a pioneer of queer cinema. And thirdly, and coming more directly out of academic film studies, another important trend began to re-examine classical and contemporary Hollywood films to analyze their construction of strong female characters. For example, 1940s film noirs like The Reckless Moment by Max Ophuls, and we had a talk about that on that first year. Similarly, our decision to show Student Nurses, an exploitation film directed by a woman, Stephanie Rothman, but produced by Roger Corman, was inspired by Pam Cook's review of the film that read it against the grain and showed how, under the stereotypical representation of sexy bimbos, the film actually dealt with crucial women's issues like abortion, while offering powerful female characters. I'll finish my little presentation by saying that at the time, the Norwich Women's Film Weekend felt like a rather modest venture, a modest event, and which I think is why we let it fall into oblivion to some extent. But looking through the programs now, I can see that it was clearly a very ambitious and important event, which in fact lasted longer than any other women's film festival in the UK, including Edinburgh and London. Finally, I must say that the event was very formative for me personally. The feminist work that I saw and read about in Norwich had a huge impact on my thesis, on my future writing and teaching, and it led me to work for 2 decades as the British correspondent for the Créteil Women's Film Festival in Paris, the longest lasting of all, and which still going on today. And finally, last but not least, the weekend created lasting bonds of friendship with many women in my personal and professional life, including, of course, the Cine women, who are now going to speak after me.
Hello, everybody. I'm Biddy, and Elizabeth B and myself are going to talk about something for us was getting involved in something completely different. The new BFI in Norwich, Cinema City, had just been created, and it offered us a venue for those who enjoyed films that were perhaps more art house than packed house. Ginette Vincendeau was instrumental in my joining Cine Women. I knew her from my work as a librarian at the University of East Anglia. Ginette was a lectrice who used French films in her language teaching, and she had become a member of the Cinema City Council of Management. Fortuitously, she was the duty manager on my nights as a voluntary usher at the cinema. We formed a friendship, and I joined with her and others to form a group of women determined to show women's films at a themed event in Norwich. Participating in the creation and the implementation of the Norwich Films Weekend complemented my involvement with the trades union movement, where I found myself sometimes forcing equality and women's issues onto the agenda. My film knowledge was that just of a regular viewer, and so mixing with people who did analysis of every scene and nuance was a weird experience. Who are they kidding? However, my expertise as a librarian working at UEA meant that I could play a role in information gathering about films, of organisations, locating articles, addresses, all resources of my own trade.
Hello. Hello, I'm Elizabeth. I moved from rural Norfolk to Norwich in June of 1979, and I went to the British Film Institute summer school in the July. I vividly remember introducing myself there, not as a housewife, but as just a housewife. On my return, I had an acting part in the East Anglian Film Co-op production. It was called Working Title, and it was just great fun. I volunteered to work with Biddy on some practical aspects of the weekend, the food, the accommodation, creche facilities. The Women's Film Weekend wasn't like other festivals where you book your place and are given details of hotels, guest houses, which the participants would book up separately. It was a very conscious decision to make the festival as accessible as to as many women as possible. So providing free accommodation if you needed it, a creche, which was run by one of the men from Cinema City's education subcommittee, and on-site food at cost price was key to this aim.
Our event was held over a weekend and we kept it going for 10 years. It always coincided with the university term, enabling a good response from the student audience. It was an era after women's movements and actions, including Greenham Common and the Dagenham strike, and there was a growing awareness and acceptance of gay and lesbian issues, which had politicised many agendas. We were aware that we wanted to attempt to embrace all the sensitivities around these subjects. But we set ourselves a challenge in offering an inclusive attendance package. In keeping with socialist principles, we offered discounted admission fees and free accommodation, and we worked very hard to find suitable places for everyone who wanted. Within the context of women's film, we also offered exhibition space, memorably works by Jo Spence and Terry Dennett in 1982, and Marianne Majoras, now known for her garden photography and portraiture, 4 of which are displayed in the National Portrait Gallery.
Even after 40 plus years, I remember the excitement and the intensity of those first years. The experience of being in the company of so many women from so many different backgrounds was wonderful. We discussed and shared ideas and thoughts not only about the films we were seeing, but also about our lives and how we understood our position in society and what we wanted for the future. I began to explore feminist issues, to see myself as a feminist. I had always been socialist, but feminist was not a term that I would use for myself. The experience of the Women's Film Weekend was for me joyous and enlightening. I felt empowered. It changed me.
There were some light-hearted moments too. Elizabeth and I were feeling very tired on the last night of one weekend, and yet feeling we really ought to stay and show our commitment. The film being shown was Marguerite Duras' India Song, which was probably quite beautiful, with its long panning shots of a dark room, little or no dialogue to follow. We both realised it was too much for us to sit through. Elizabeth got up to go. I followed. And just at that very moment, a voice from the film pushed its way into the cinema. "And where are they going?" this voice questioned. At which point, all we could do was sit back down and stifle our giggles. Turning to the films we screened, I would say that the Irish films, such as Anne Crilly's Mother Island, and those by Pat Murphy, including Maeve and Devlin, and her early student production, Rituals of Memory, had the most impact on me, as I've had a fascination for that country for a very long time. In addition, the important output of the Sheffield Film Co-op was influential in bringing to the screen issues that women have faced, such as in the workplace in Sheffield, in the film Women of Steel, as well as women experiencing the inequality of low-paid jobs in A Question of Choice, and the impact on the women of Glasgow of the 1915 rent strike called Red Skirts on Clydeside.
I remember watching The Riddles of the Sphinx, where Laura Mulvey does a 360-degree pan of the woman's kitchen at worktop level. And I thought, yes, that's how I feel sometimes, as if my horizons were cut short.
I loved being part of this group of beautiful, hardworking women, achieving something in a region beyond London. Up until then, even the British Film Institute in London had only featured women's films. They'd not screened an event, and certainly not one created, curated, managed, and implemented by a group of women.
And another film that had an impact on me was Rosie the Riveter. How amazing it was. Yes, I thought, aren't women wonderful?
Hello, I'm Caroline. It's just really nice to be here tonight along with my friends. I'm so glad we could do this. I recently read a newspaper article called Muriel Box, Britain's most prolific female filmmaker. I'll start again. I recently read a newspaper article called Muriel Box, Britain's most prolific female director you've never heard of. The peg for this article was major retrospectives of her work at 2 international film festivals in 2018. The writer noted that Box and her fellow pioneers were somehow still not definitively included in the history of cinema, despite periodic revivals. The 5 of us shared all the work of organising the Women's Film Weekend, but at the same time, we all had our own special interests and enthusiasms. I was studying for an MA in film history and theory at UEA when the event began, and I'd started to notice that if you looked in the index of any standard work on British film, there weren't any women's names quite often. And this could mean one of 2 things. No women had worked in the industry, or, as we actually knew, of course, they had, but they were disregarded. It's fair to say that 40 years ago, British cinema in general wasn't highly regarded or the subject of much academic interest. Even within feminist film circles, archival interest generally extended as far as European and American directors such as Alice Guy, Dorothy Arzner, Ida Lupino. So it was exciting for me to discover a number of British women who'd made a significant contribution to the industry, both in feature films and in documentaries. I didn't do this all by myself, of course. It was with the help of film historians such as Elaine Burrows at the BFI and of Charles Barr at UEA that I began to identify and research the work of British women feature film and documentary makers. Today, Muriel Box, along with Wendy Toy, Kay Mander and Jill Craigie, are the subjects of PhD theses, events, exhibitions and so on, part of the mainstream of women's cinema history. But back then, shockingly, they were disregarded, despite the fact that they'd been working in the 1950s and 60s, and some were carrying on working. So we decided to focus our archival strand on British cinema and television history, and this became one of the hallmarks of the Norwich Women's Film Weekend. Looking back, I'm particularly proud of this. In the early 1980s, these forgotten filmmakers were still very much alive and in some cases still working. And although others would certainly have rediscovered them, we can claim to have helped in the process of what you might call their rehabilitation. We may even have started some of it. So from then on, there were larger revivals of their work, such as the Créteil Festival in 1990, the one that Ginette had been involved in, with a retrospective of Muriel Box and Wendy Toy's films in their presence, and I was there interviewing them both. The recent major retrospectives I referred to at the beginning, and many other events, such as a 2018 exhibition of Jill Craigie's work at BAFTA, suggest that these women may finally be getting the recognition they deserve. I hope so, as this ongoing cycle of rediscovery is sometimes disheartening. Looking back, I realise how fortunate we and the Women's Film Weekend audiences were, not just to be able to screen certain films, and this wasn't nearly as easy or straightforward as it is now for many reasons, but to also have their directors there, to meet those women who we now think of as pioneers, and to hear from them in their own words about their experience of working in the industry was a real privilege. And now I'm just going to say a few words about 4 directors who came to different women's film weekends to discuss their films with the audience. Each year we'd have to choose just 1 or 2 from their large body of work. They were all generous, lively, and interested in this new, younger audience. They wanted to interact and ask questions themselves. Listening to tape recordings of these conversations recently, of some of them, I have to say I'm struck by the contrast with similar post-film discussions I've witnessed with some older male titans of the British film industry. So Muriel Box spent her entire career in the film industry, from Oscar-nominated scriptwriter in the 1940s and head of the script department at Gainsborough Studios, to director of 13 feature films in the 1950s and 60s, after she and her producer husband, Sidney Box, established their own production company. Box was immensely persistent and hardworking, and she did often suffer prejudice in the male-dominated industry. Her feminism, a term she embraced, was represented in many ways, including in the humorous and caustic eye her comedies cast on the relationships between women and men. One of these was 1955's Simon and Laura, a satire on early TV soaps. But as well as comedies, Box used her films to explore some controversial themes and social problems. One of these, Too Young to Love, addressed teenage sex, abortion and syphilis, and was banned in some places. At the Women's Film Weekend, we showed the first film she both wrote and directed, which was Street Corner, a drama from 1953 examining the new phenomenon of female police officers. In contrast, the other woman director active in the 1950s, Wendy Toy, had other highly acclaimed careers as a dancer, choreographer and stage director, so filmmaking represented just a certain period in her professional careers. Her first film was a surreal fantasy called The Stranger Left No Card, and it won the prize for Best Short Film at Cannes in 1952. But the feature films she subsequently made under contract to Alexander Korda and to Rank were mostly broad comedies which tended to playfully undermine and sabotage male arrogance. One of these was All for Mary, made in 1956, which we screened at the Women's Film Weekend in 1986. Wendy Toy said at the time she regretted that Rank didn't support her wish to make features more ambitious than lightweight comedies, but she was pleased by the way that as a working director, she paved the way for other women to enter the industry. Kay Mander was a member of the British documentary movement of the 1940s, directing social documentaries and many training films. After the war, she wanted to direct her own films, but her battle with sexism in the industry meant that she eventually returned to working in continuity, which is what she'd done a long time before, and she carried on doing this until she retired. She was the first female member of the film union, the ACT, which is now BECTU, and she was a lifelong socialist. Her 1945 film, Homes for the People, commissioned by the Labour Party, had interviews with 5 housewives who criticised their living conditions and were pleading the case for better housing. After our screening of this film, I asked Kay Mander if it was easy being a female director in the 1940s, and she laughed. A damn sight easier than it was in the 50s and 60s. It wasn't until the end of the 50s that one started to be told there weren't any films suitable for a woman to direct because they weren't at that moment making any films on needlework or domestic science or whatever. That's a quote from her. Jill Craigie directed films between 1944 and 1951 that were overtly feminist and socialist. Some blended entertainment with activism, like her short film about equal pay for women, To Be a Woman, which we screened at the 1985 Women's Film Weekend. We also showed her only feature film, Blue Scar, a drama set in a Welsh mining village, which explored the implications of coal industry nationalisation in 1947. Jill Craigie struggled with the standards she set herself as a director and with the lack of training opportunities for women in the industry, and she decided to quit. She remained in the public eye, both as a feminist writer and an activist, and as the wife of the former Labour Party leader, Michael Foot. But as a filmmaker, she was soon forgotten.
Hi, oh gosh. Hi everyone. Thanks everyone for participating tonight and for being part of this event.
Yeah, you're on.
Hold on. Norwich is a city with an impressive number of striking medieval buildings, testifying to its history as a powerhouse of the wool trade. One of them, Suckling House, now Cinema City, has a wooden staircase. If you go up the stairs, you get to the office on the first floor. If you go further up, there is a second floor which used to have the projection box and another room. As a young woman in my early 20s, I often went up to that second floor and I often entered that other room. It was where I learned the basics of what later became my livelihood, filmmaking. In my memory, the room was an attic, but I'm not sure that it really was, or maybe the attic was where we stored all the film canisters and equipment that quickly accumulated with the activities of a group that started as the East Anglian Filmmakers Co-op and later was known simply as EAF, East Anglian Filmmakers. Memory and history, history and memory, these were important themes of the Norwich Women's Film Weekend, partly because the event became a way of reappraising women's role in film production, and more unusually and radically, as Caroline has just described, by choosing to focus on then neglected women working in the British film industry. But also because many of the contemporary films we showed deliberately and powerfully recast history from a female perspective. I'm thinking of Helma Sanders Brahms' Germany, Pale Mother, Pat Murphy's Maeve and Anne Devlin, Claudia Alleman's Blind Spot, and Margarita von Trotter's Two German Sisters. Thinking about, writing about, and remembering the Norwich Women's Film Weekend for this event tonight has involved an unearthing of our own histories and a ploughing of our individual and collective memories. I started this talk with the East Anglian Filmmakers Attic because my memories of that time are like several conduits running concurrently and mingling. In 1979, the year of the first event, I was 25. I had finished my BA in English literature at UEA a few years earlier, and then started research for an MPhil in film studies. I soon started teaching film studies in Reading. Laura Mulvey was one of my colleagues. So I was living in Norwich, traveling to Reading, making trips to the BFI library in London to research my thesis, getting involved in Cine Women and the Norwich Women's Film Weekend, and also becoming very immersed in the East Anglian Film Co-op. Since the age of 7, I had wanted to become a famous film director. There weren't many role models of famous film directors who were female at the time, so I used to keep this ambition to myself. When I heard about EAF opening just up the road at Cinema City, I was drawn there like a moth to a flame. Filmmaker Tim Rayner was instrumental in getting it going. People who worked at Anglia TV became involved and helped by donating equipment and getting film processed on the quiet. We had regular meetings, loads of intense debate about the politics and aesthetics of filmmaking, and occasional visiting speakers. Everything was done on 16mm. For me and many others, East Anglian Filmmakers was an accessible way of learning the basics of film production. A group of us formed a women's filmmaking group and made 2 films, Working Title, which Lizzie mentioned, and Backland, both of which were shown at the Norwich Women's Film Weekend. Our feminist filmmaking group had many overlaps with cine women. Myself, Caroline, and Elizabeth were in both. At the time, there was a burgeoning loose kind of network of independent filmmaking groups throughout the UK. This fed into the programming of the Norwich Women's Film Weekend. We showed films made by the Berwick Street Collective, Leeds Animation Workshop, the Filmmakers Co-op in London, Sheffield Film Co-op, Birmingham Film and Video Workshop, Cinema Action from South Wales, and the wonderfully named Sprockets, based in York. We also showed work by individual women filmmakers, now perhaps more than then recognised as pioneering. Chantal Ackerman, Valley Export, Sally Potter, Margaret Tate, Tina Keane, Jo Spence, Pat Murphy, Annabelle Nicholson, Yvonne Rayner, and Jan Oxenberg. Women whose work came to be identified with the avant-garde, structuralist and performance aspects of independent and art cinema. Women whose work in different ways addressed sexual and gender politics. We also had speakers from the feminist film distribution organisations such as COW, Cinema of Women, and Circles. Looking back from 2020, I'm deeply impressed by the curation of the Norwich Women's Film Weekend. I think we achieved a radical and adventurous programme. It has made us all think about its legacy. When you're in your 20s, you kind of live in the moment. You don't need to reflect backwards much. For a while, Cinema City was a place I spent a great deal of time in, going up and down those stairs. There are several old plaques on the wall, and at the time I didn't give them much thought. One of them is dedicated to Laura Stewart, who was the sister of Ethel and Helen Coleman. It was these 2 sisters, Ethel and Helen, who bought Suckling House in 1923 and had Stewart Hall built, Cinema City's main auditorium, to commemorate their sister Laura, who had died. In 1925, they gave the 2 buildings to the City of Norwich to be used for the advancement of education in its widest and most comprehensive sense. Ethel, Helen, and Laura were rather extraordinary women. Suffragettes, very active in the civic and educational life of Norwich. Ethel later became the first female Lord Mayor in England, and she asked her younger sister Helen to be her Lady Mayoress. In 1918, the 3 sisters set up Norwich's branch of the National Council of Women. Laura, the one who died, organised, among other things, the Norwich Ladies Camera Club. 54 years after Suckling Hall and Stewart Hall were given to the city, cine women took on a feminist agenda that the Coleman sisters would have appreciated. History and memory, memory and history. Perhaps embedded in those 15th century and 20th century walls, they left an invitation for us that we unconsciously took up.
I think we're all here. Yep.
Hello.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those wonderful accounts. Such a pleasure to have you all here this evening. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to remember and reflect individually and together. I just want to remind viewers that the stream chat is open to the right-hand side of the screen. So if at any point you have a question that you would like to ask, please do write in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that, and I will put your question to the panel. So, wow, where to start? There's so many places to potentially start. I suppose I was interested in Ginette's account that there was sniggering at this almost kind of majority male council of management. What kind of challenges did you face at the outset? Who did you have to convince to make this happen?
Well, the whole council of management, I must say my memory is very hazy. I remember also, I want to say, those meetings were very enjoyable and it was very friendly, but I think that I do remember that when I suggested doing something to do with women's films, it wasn't immediately taken up, and there were a few sniggers, although there was also some support, and of course the fact that it actually took place is testifies to that. I think that on the whole, and I don't know if there are people from those days who are going to join, but generally speaking, the kind of cinema that was being programmed tended to be very much the kind of art cinema, the kind of European art cinema, and very aesthetically pleasing or important films, and it was a very good program. But I think it's introducing the idea of a program based on women's films, so introduced, and feminism was introducing a political element, which wasn't what the group was set up for. So I think that's what there was probably hesitation and a little bit of disbelief. But I'm afraid my memory is very patchy, but what I have to go on is the fact that we organized these events and they were supported. And we should also say they were supported financially by the cinema, which is of course not negligible in the fact that we had to produce a budget for those visitors. The cinema would have the prints of the films brought to Norwich. There was of course that was part of its remit, but I think it was this introduction of some. I mean, my other cine women might want to add to that, but it seems to me it was the sort of introducing a more political aspect with a clearly feminist event, but at the same time, it was supported by the institution, and we're very grateful to it.
Was there? It's interesting because at that time there were women-only spaces for screening of films. Did you have to kind of reach an agreement, or how did you reach a decision about whether they would be mixed? Because I mean, these were mixed screenings. It wasn't a kind of women-only space.
Yes, it was. There were mixed screenings, and I think the events through the years were very much part of those debates that were raging at the time of whether they should be women-only meeting. There were some. There was disagreement, and we were criticized occasionally by the audience for not having. I think some people saw the event as not radical enough by including mixed audiences. But part of it was, I think, the fact that I don't think we believed in having this kind of total separation, but also we had to accommodate the fact that we were in a public building with an institution that had its own remit as an art cinema. So I suppose there was an element of compromise in that respect. But I think I'm sure my friends will have some things to add to that. But I suppose we were trying to strike a balance between the more radical wings of the movement at the time and our sense of providing a venue also for the people of Norwich and for people who wanted to come and see certain films. So there was an element of compromise.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I think one of the things we also have to remember is that Cinema City had a male manager, it had a male projectionist, it had a male barman, and there was no way we could actually get away from having men in the building. And so to provide a solely women's place was not feasible. Again, as Ginette sort of alluded to, under the sort of remit that they had to actually operate the place because we didn't have people to fulfill those particular roles. And yes, although it never particularly bothered us, there were issues from the audience, but we seemed to weather most of it. And I think people either accepted it and came again, or they didn't accept it and didn't come again. But you can't get away from the fact that men were involved in the running and organisation of the actual cinema itself.
Yes, I think also that I agree. And I think also that the fact that, as it happened, we were all heterosexual women, inevitably had an influence on the way we approach the event. It seems to, sort of thinking back. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of this kind of question of logistics too, Teresa, you talked about being involved with ETH before being a member of Cine Women. Is that right? Is that the timing right for that?
No. It was kind of all happened at the same time.
Right.
So, yeah.
And there was access that you were able to, access certain facilities from organisations like ETH, and you mentioned Anglia Television.
Yeah, ETH was literally in Cinema City. It had its own room. So it was very much part of the fabric of the place. And yeah, because there were people who joined ETH who worked at Anglia TV, and they kind of helped out with equipment and film and developing costs, which was a huge benefit. And I think it's also important, it's quite interesting to remember that this whole filmmaking workshop movement, which kind of had predated all this, but it was helped by the commencement of Channel 4. Channel 4 is a very different animal now, but at the time it was a very innovative and quite radical television channel, and they had a dedicated independent film. They had actually a person, Alan Fountain, who commissioned work from the workshop sector. So there was a huge amount going on, and as it was then, ACTT, which used to be an extremely closed shop, the Film and TV Union, they enabled some of the people involved in the workshops to get union tick cards, and which helped them to earn their living as filmmakers, and in fact I benefited from that. So it was a time when there was a lot going on.
Were there and aside from kind of organisations more directly involved in cinema and television, do you? And this is a kind of for anybody who wants to take the question, were there other women's organisations in Norwich that were active that you were speaking to throughout the city? Caroline?
Yeah, I was going to add to what Teresa said, that in fact what we were doing when you were talking about other training courses for women, was that it wasn't so much that we were involved in training other women in making films at all, because we were needing to be trained ourselves. You know, it's very, very basic. But we were teaching adult education classes which were about women in film, at least one of which, possibly two of which, were about women in film. So it's sort of the Women's Film Weekend kind of fed into that as well. Mm. And so in doing that, we were very much involved with other women's groups in the city and got to know other women's groups and other women's organisations. And yes, we always kind of promoted other women's groups and asked them to accommodate people for, you know, the Women's Film Weekend. You know, I just shamelessly used to ring around and say, you know, can you have someone to stay for nothing? Thank you very much. But yeah, it was, you know, we were generating quite a lot of interest. But it also strikes me thinking about this now, and when Ginette said, you know, where the budget and the support came from, that there's no way you could do anything like that now. You know, cinemas, a picture house cinema wouldn't be supporting all this activity that had money being put into it. It was really very good, you know, even though we did it on a relatively low budget in many ways, you know, there still had to be quite a bit of money, and it cost money to put it on. And it wasn't easy to put it on because we had to access actual films, you know, and project actual films. And it was all a business. It was a business getting those resources together. It really was. And finding out about people and what they were doing, you know, even finding out about, you know, the women I talked about. Nowadays, you just Google someone, but then you weren't even sure if they were alive.
But it's very interesting because it places Laura Mulvey as this figure that Ginette went to visit. And, you know, sorry, Ginette.
No, go on. I wanted to just add something to.
Please do.
Thinking about support and what Caroline is absolutely right, that you wouldn't have the support for this kind of event today, and also what Teresa said about Channel 4, and I was thinking also the role of the BFI, the British Film Institute, that, you know, that I don't think they could today support an event like that on an ongoing basis, you know, because they did support it, both supplying advice, like putting us onto Laura Mulvey, bringing speakers. We also had speakers from UEA, but we did have, there was a lot more support, I think, in those days than from all those different sources than we would have today.
Most of you have alluded to the way that you work together, and I really love this idea that, you know, for instance, Biddy, you know, you had a particular set of interests and a particular set of specialisms that you could bring to the role, and this wonderful sense of, you know, the power of collective working. I'm curious to know how you went about programming each of the weekends. I mean, just in a very kind of practical sense, what the process was like. And that whoever wants to take up the question.
I can't remember. These filters used to appear out of nowhere. No, I think because there were, I think the university did play a critical role because of the start of film studies and because there was this general interest. And the resources for me in the library were being made available where I could sort of find out what was going on. But for those who had a more London-centred life, you know, you sort of, you know, Teresa working, doing her research at the BFI, you sort of found out what was going on. Ginette with Créteil, you know, there was stuff going on that sort of all came together, and we were able to, using a very women's term, we were able to knit it together really quite effectively. I'll let other people carry on with that theme.
Yeah. My memories of it are very much, we used to have meetings at each other's houses.
Yes.
You know, we circulated around each other's houses, and we kind of, I was going to say fought it out, but we didn't fight. It was very interesting that we had our own interests and we had our own enthusiasms. We really did. and yet they seem to be accommodated within it. There seemed to be a way of accommodating everything that we wanted to do. So, you know, if I'd say, yeah, these British women, you know, not everybody was that keen on everything, but there were also aspects of it that we agreed on because we felt they were important. We felt they were important and they mattered. And we also had meetings there were 2 feminist distributors at the time who looked after independent films. They were called Cinema of Women, or COW, and Circles. And so we'd have meetings with people from them, represent their representatives, and they would say what's new and what's coming up. And we'd say, okay. And then we would get to, I think it was important that we tried to see the films that we were going to be screening, because otherwise that could cause problems. But yeah, we had those friendly meetings and established a lot and managed to persuade people, like as Elizabeth mentioned, you know, to get a man to run the creche and, you know, just sort of do stuff. We just said, okay, we'll do that. And I think that was just born out of enthusiasm, really.
Yeah, I mean, I just to add to Caroline, I think I'm very struck now in retrospect, as you said, we had different interests, but we didn't fight. And I think the way we put together today's presentation is also a good mirror of it, because we kind of almost spontaneously said, well, we'll do this, we'll do that. And I think the fact that we had such complementary interest was like, I mean, that was partly luck, I suppose, but also I think that's what made it successful, because we all brought very different things, and we hadn't planned it that way. It just happened to we kind of added, you know, each other to the group and managed to have different interests without kind of fighting, or, you know, we didn't fall out with each other or anything like that. It was very much communal work. And I think what we were all saying tonight and the different ways and the different interests is kind of like a mirror of what happened at the time.
There is, I mean, you've talked also about the relationship to London, and, you know, there's this sense of BFI as having the kind of outpost at Cinema City. So I'd be interested to hear from as many of you as possible. What did working in Norwich afford at that time?
Well, I'd actually just moved back from London, I think, at the time I got involved in Cinema City, and I used to go to the South Bank quite a lot, and, you know, that was where my interest in film probably started, which when Cinema City started, I thought, yes, there's somewhere in Norwich I can go and see decent films that weren't sort of, you know, shooting people and car chases and all the rest of it, and it was a great joy to have something that I could also get involved with voluntarily, because it also meant I saw a film free every week. But, you know, London was, it was still far away, I think, in those days. It was probably still, you know, 3 hours on the train or something. But yeah, I was just very, very pleased that Norwich could bring in an art cinema and have it be successful, and for me to be part of that, and also to contribute in terms of, you know, creating whatever it is that, you know, we've created with Cine Women and the Norwich Women's Films Weekend. And of course there were other people later who joined us, and they brought different perspectives.
And I had moved from Brighton, which is a very exciting place, to rural Norfolk, which has its charm. But I was in rural Norfolk for quite a while, and then when we moved into Norwich, it was so exciting. It was like, yay, a city. And yes, I think it did feel the whole time moving into Norwich, and the Women's Film Weekend and making films, it was just amazing, really. It was just, very exciting, and the event, I cannot overemphasize how exciting the events were. You know, every year it was hard work, and as Biddy said, she and I were so exhausted at the end, as I'm sure other people were as well. But it was wonderful, you know. It was just great, and Norwich is a very special place, and always will be, in my memory, anyway.
Well, I don't want to. I thought so. I was coming from the other the opposite of experience to Elizabeth, because I was coming from Paris, and I'd never lived in a small town like Norwich. It seemed small to me at the time, and what I think I valued particularly was I mean, Caroline alluded to it. There was a kind of collegiality, the fact that you could go into each other's houses very easily and have endless coffee and so on. And I think maybe this is rose tinted now, you know, from a great age of sort of thinking we all had so much time then. But I mean, I thought Norwich was a great place because it had a lot of amenities. It had that wonderful cinema and all sorts of other things, but on a, you know, manageable scale. And I think it enabled meetings to me, I think, in a way which maybe was easier than it would have been, you know, in a bigger city, perhaps. And, you know, but it had all these amenities, and it had, of course, UEA. Several of us alluded to the, you know, the fact that film studies was developing, also the filmmakers cooperative that Teresa was talking about. So there were all these things going on, but in a place where it was, which felt very friendly. I mean, at least that's my memory of it when I think of those days now.
Yeah, I mean, there can't be many other places in the UK where your film theatre is in this amazing medieval building, or part of it anyway. So yeah, I mean, we were talking to Henry yesterday, and he said how he'd sort of fallen in love with Norwich, and it happens. I grew up in London. When I lived in Norwich, I totally fell in love with Norwich and thought I never want to live anywhere else. When I moved back to London, it was the reverse. But you know, you definitely have your Norwich and Norfolk as well. Not, you know, it's not just Norwich. And when the second film we made at East Anglia Filmmakers was set in the Fens, and part of the story of the film was to do with women working on the land. So, you know, you discover many things. Yeah, it has a lot to offer, but I suspect, I mean, now do you feel it's a more difficult place? What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, I mean, I think as you suggested earlier, I mean, the funding landscape is entirely different under austerity, and you know, there are cultural organisations that have come to dominate in Norwich, which I think have had a kind of a somewhat monocultural effect. Yeah, it doesn't feel like there is as much space as there has been previously. But I think also maybe that is about youth as well, because my involvement with artist-led organisations was in my early to mid-20s, you know, and that feeling of being together and a space that is like a gallery, that's the office, you know, the social club, the disco, all of those things folded in. There's a kind of an intensity of living at that age that that also is bound up with a kind of, the curiosity and a kind of naivety for me.
Just could I just say, sorry to butt in, just going from what Teresa was just talking about on the films that you had produced, there was a question from Francis Scott saying, and perhaps to Teresa, but perhaps to you all as well. Phil and I wondered if you preferred making the films or showing them or watching them. It's not a binary question.
Well, that's a hard one to answer. Of course, I loved making films, but it's very, very tough. Not an easy thing to pull off. So in a funny way, I think I love watching films. That would come first in a way. Yeah.
Just on that, Teresa, I have a great friend who I was at college with called Helena Mickey, and she's just made a film about a French painter, and I see her struggle to try and get it screened, and I'm thinking what we would have offered her would have been not an automatic, but I'm pretty certain that we would have accepted her film for screening, and how difficult it is for women these days to get their particular films shown. And it is striking the difference again in 40 years on. Things have changed, but they haven't changed. And it would be very interesting to talk to some young women, independent filmmakers now, to see how they are, sort of navigating the landscape of distribution and screening.
I looked up, there were some statistics I discovered recently, and it was from 2017, but it was the most recent one I could find. And it showed, I think it was 17% of films were directed by women in Europe. 17%, yeah. Which is now, is bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think it's to take a more optimistic kind of view, because now I work in contemporary art, and that's a very different landscape, and that so many artists make films, and it isn't seen as a difficult thing to do. The technology is so much easier now. So a lot of women artists are making films and getting them shown. Not always easy, but it's easier.
I think also that that figure of 17%, it must be an average, and like all averages, it kind of is confusing, and it does vary from country to country a lot, and it actually, I think, mirrors the state of the film industry in each country, and I mean, there are in France, for example, there are now more than 30% of
yes,
films are made by women.
Yeah.
So there must be countries where it's like dismally 5% or something.
Yes, it's an average, yeah.
So, but so I think it's still very tough, and it's tough because it's an expensive business, even though with digital cameras it's arguably easier today. But as Biddy and so were saying, that it's getting it shown and getting it seen is very difficult. But to go back to the initial question, for me anyway, I made one tiny film, sort of a training film, and I'm full of admiration for people who make films because it's incredibly difficult. So it was, seeing the films was to me what it's about, but that's only a personal view, because that's what I do. I kind of work analyzing films, but yeah.
Could I ask, why did it end?
We left. We left Norwich.
Yeah.
Probably Ginette should answer that.
Well, I'm not sure, and I think this is. Yes, I think it's partly, as I said in my presentation, we're very proud of the fact that our event lasted longer than any other in the UK, and I think if you look at the history of these kind of festivals, they very rarely last very long, because, and at the same time as we were talking about the wonderful support we had from Cinema City, from the BFI and so on, we also have to remember that we all did this voluntarily.
Right.
So in a way, those events, it can work if people can give a lot of time, and we could at the time, and we wanted to. But I think, yes, we left Norwich in the sense that our lives and jobs and careers and everything took different paths. And it's true that now none of us actually lives in Norwich anymore. So we personally, I got a job at the University of Warwick in 1987. So that took me, away from Norwich, and it was increasingly difficult to maintain the commute between Warwick, Norwich, and London. The kind of the horrors of Shipley Hill and crossing the Sept on the railway line. So I think it's partly events in our lives, and we all went in different directions.
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear what you each went to do after.
Well, I went to teach at.
You went to Warwick.
I became a film academic. I did a thesis in film at UEA, and then went on to teach film and write about films, and which is what I'm still doing today, primarily French cinema, but not only reviewing films and that kind of thing. So that's the way, as well as I mentioned briefly the Créteil Festival, which was very important for me for many, many years of being their British correspondent. So that was like a kind of offshoot of the Norwich Women's Film Weekend. There was very much films I'd seen at Norwich I could recommend to Créteil. So there was an overlap between the two. But then not living in Norwich made it difficult to organize the event. Yeah.
Elizabeth, what did you do when you finished?
Well, I left same year as Ginette in '87, and we moved to Edinburgh, and I did an MPhil research degree in education, and really haven't done much in film since, really. I'm interested in film, but in terms of the involvement, like with the Women's Film Weekend, that was a one-off for me, that I haven't been involved in film since then. Which is perhaps why it's so it burns so brightly.
Yeah.
It was a great time. Yeah.
Caroline, on finishing at Norwich Women's Film Weekend, what did you go on to do?
Well, I did a few things, but I was teaching part-time. I travelled a lot for my work as well at the time. I taught at what was then Leicester Polytechnic. I taught film at Leicester, which is now North Walsham University. So I still lived in Norwich. I lived in Norwich for a long time. I was the film and photography officer at the Eastern Arts Association for a while as well. And then I went into journalism after that. I wanted to be doing something rather than teaching about it. So yeah. But what I wanted to add was that it wasn't like we left and it ended. There were other women who were involved in it. And for the last 2 years, I think some of us were just sort of there in a more or less advisory role.
Yeah.
And there was a group of other women who did actually run the weekend, and it was in a slightly different form those last 2 weekends. So it perhaps was slightly reduced in its scope, if you like. So they didn't want to do the archival strand anymore. There was a more specific statement about wanting to look at films made by, focusing on individual independent filmmakers and feminist films. And the audience gradually changed and shifted, I think, with that. But I think what remained, and I think of those women, some of whom I'm in touch with, or one or two, only remember having done it for 1 year. So it was something that felt like there wasn't that impetus anymore to keep it carrying on. And those women tended to be mostly, I think, from UEA as well, somehow people who'd studied film at UEA or who worked at UEA. And it was very much, I think it wouldn't have happened had it not been for the existence of UEA and the presence of film studies there, the combination, the coming together of film and at UEA and of the fact of Cinema City, which was pretty impressive in those days as it is now. But in comparison with other regional film theatres, it was pretty good. And, you know, it really was. So, yeah, I did a number of things and later on retrained and became a psychotherapist.
Same question for you, Biddy. On finishing, what did you do?
Look, I have to say, I haven't ever left Norwich because I think I'm probably the only one here who was actually born in Norfolk, and still it remains my home city. It's my heartland anyway. But no, my career took over, and I got various promotions in London, back in London. I'd been at college in London and came back to Norfolk and then went back to London to take promotions. And then I ended up in Sheffield for my last post. And after that, I became president of the librarians sort of professional body and became their president. And that took me around the world. And so it was really, my career took me away from perhaps something that had given me a huge interest and a huge sort of confidence, and it's something I was always proud to put on my CV, you know, the fact that I had been part of a group that had created something that I always felt was original and unique. And so I always am very thankful to Ginette particularly, who sort of got me involved. So thank you.
Well, we very much enjoyed those joint evenings of being me being duty manager and Biddy being I'm sure if we sat down and tried to reminisce, there are kind of various. I remember one evening we were showing a German. This was the time of new German cinema, and there was somebody who left the cinema outraged and saying, "This has got subtitles. It's in German." And, you know, it's kind of like so we had a lot of fun during those evenings. Yeah.
And Teresa, you went on to work in film.
Yes, I left Norwich, I think either 83 or 84, and armed with my union ticket, I was able to work as a lowly assistant film editor in TV and film. Yeah, it's strange to think now, but a lot of television was shot and edited on 16mm. So that's what I did, and then kind of worked my way up and eventually directed and so on. Yeah.
There's a question for you, Teresa, from Jane Hill. Is the film Backland on location in the Fens, and is there an online platform where these historic films can be seen today?
Well, that's a good question, and not at the moment. No, I don't even know where the print of Backland is. There is certainly a 16mm print somewhere.
It's in the East Anglian Film Archive.
Okay.
I put it there myself because I worked there for a while, and it is there. I had a print of it in my attic, and it's in the archive, and it may have been digitized. I'm not sure.
Okay. So at the moment, Jane, no, but it may be possible. And Cara, that's another job you had, East Anglian Film Archive.
Yeah, I've had loads of jobs, me. Yeah.
There's a couple of things that have been mentioned in the chat that I thought I should say from different people. Lawrence Bradbury was saying that we didn't know about Norwich Women's Film Weekend. Really exciting to learn new stuff about the cultural history of our city. Kay Warbrick was having some difficulty connecting, but she's going to watch it back later. She remembers the events with fondness. Us Women's Centre used to join in and have people staying over. Great atmosphere in the bar, interesting films and women and conversations. The first one that she went to was actually the introduction for her to non-mainstream films. Sarah Mason saying red skirts on Clydeside. Before one of you mentioned it, she mentioned it in the chat. That was nice. Chris Wilkinson, camera, hope you're watching. And Lucy Harris saying thank you all, clapping loudly.
Hey.
There's also a comment from Rosie Dayton saying how did you connect with and welcome audiences for the event?
Connect with what was that, Henry?
How do you connect with and welcome audiences for the event?
Advertising, promotion. We used to walk around with posters.
Lots of social media.
It was before social media.
In-person social media, yeah.
The cinema, I mean, Cinema City had a pretty good structure in place for advertising, but you're right, Biddy, I'd forgotten about going around putting posters up everywhere. Yeah, that's right.
We all had bicycles.
Yeah, but we did always welcome the audience, as far as I remember, particularly because there were speakers. Yeah, so I think there was always it wasn't just the films were shown and that was it.
No.
They were introduced always.
And
Yeah.
questions.
Well, we used to take it in turns, didn't we? And sort of somebody would take it, introduce the filmmaker if they were there. No, I do remember quite a lot of interpersonal activity that we undertook in order to sort of at least give a human touch to it. People didn't just sit down and the film started.
Yeah, I think we probably forgot to say that all the films were introduced and there were Q&As. I mean, it sort of seems so obvious, but yeah, we did all that.
Yeah, and a lot of visiting filmmakers, quite an impressive roster. Yeah.
I think that's one thing that I was remembering suddenly, and it was extraordinary, the people that came, the filmmakers that came from all over the place, all over the world.
And
they came to Norwich. I mean, that's another thing. They thought Norwich was, Cinema City was worth visiting. To come and talk about their films there and to screen them. It was quite remarkable, actually. And I actually even remember things like, a print of a French film, and Ginette, which came without subtitles, Ginette actually literally doing a simultaneous translation out loud as the film was going on, which was, all part of what we did. Yeah.
Elizabeth, you were going to say something.
Yes, I was going to say, also, in terms of the audience, there was a great bar at Cinema City, and because there was, I mean, at times there was sort of free food that, people had donated and stuff, so, and drink. So, we would all be in the bar, so you could talk to people and welcome them and hear what they had to say about the film. So it was, I mean, it just felt very welcoming, really. It wasn't, I mean, I said in my talk, it wasn't like other kind of festivals. It was very particular, it was very warm, really, and not small, but in, a lot of interactions going all the time. And, at the end of the film, people would mostly come out and sit about and talk or go to a discussion group or whatever. But it just kind of felt very comfortable and easy, and just nice, a nice place to be, really.
Last question before we finish, perhaps. Is there a place for materials produced throughout the duration of the 10 years of the events? Is there a place for them to be deposited? An ideal archive? Where would that be?
We've talked about this. It's a job yet to be done, Jonathan, and I think we all agree that we would like it to be done. And it's just a case of getting it will need some resources put towards it to do it. I mean, I think there are various options that are ahead of us. The university itself, the BFI. Caro, I think you had another suggestion at some point about where it
Women's Library. There's the BFI library, which is one obvious place, but there's also the Women's Library that would be another good place.
Yeah. Someone even, a friend I was talking to even mentioned the Simone de Beauvoir Center in Paris, but we all agreed that would be nice, but it would be better if it was in the UK. And I think UEA, if it was in Norwich, would be very good.
Yeah.
But,
I'm too far away from who is in the library and the archive at UEA now, but my personal choice would be that it is something that belongs to Norwich, because it started in Norwich and it is it has a particular place, I think, in Norwich. So if there is anybody from the University of East Anglia, library, archive, whatever, listening, please get in touch.
yeah.
Okay, all right, well, let's bring it to an end. I just would like to thank you all once again for agreeing to take part in this. Thank you, Ginette, Elizabeth, Caroline, Biddy, Teresa, and also thank you to Arts at the Assembly House, to Henry for hosting this evening's event and for doing a stellar technical job behind the scenes. And thank you all at home or wherever you might be tuning in on a device for joining us this evening. As I said earlier, this will be recorded and will be available to view again. So if you have friends or if you know anybody that might like to view it again, please do send them to the Assembly House online. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Just a few words to round up following Jonathan. As he said, it will be able to you'll be able to watch it again, and it'll be on the same video that you're watching it now. The link will stay the same, and it will just stay like as a record of what happened tonight. Thank you all again, as Jonathan said, for being involved and for preparing the presentation. It's really great to be able to bring you together, and I hope that some archive manifests itself somewhere soon. And thank you, Jonathan, for organising it and helping bring everyone together. The Often By events have been really, really great part of this programme. Coming up over the next couple of months, the events continue every 2 weeks on a Thursday at 7:30. The next event on September the 17th is Echoed Structured Echo, with Carl Foster, Kimberly Foster and Victoria Mitchell, who are presenting themselves as And But, which is a digital material dialogue using Samuel Beckett's The Unnameable as a catalyst. On October the 1st, we have Sarah Lowndes coming back for the third part of her readings from her book of contemporary artists working outside the city. This will be on Chris Burden and the Topanga Canyon. The full title of the talk is In a Free Spot, Chris Burden and the Topanga Canyon, California, 1985 to 2015. On October the 15th, we'll have the 4th International Poetry Reading hosted by Kai Draper. We don't have the lineup for that yet. That'll be released soon. October 29th is Jess Fernie. We'll be doing a talk probably about the Archive of Destruction project that she was hoping to launch this year, but has been postponed due to COVID. And November 12th will be the next Often By. Put it in your diaries. I don't know what from Stanley. And then finally, November 26th, we have Original Projects joining us from Great Yarmouth, Caboose, Clayton and Jules Devonshire. And I'm not sure what they'll be doing, but I'm sure it'll be great. They've just signed the lease on a new fantastic space that is opening its doors this weekend, tomorrow and Saturday, if you want to go and see old Debenham store spread over 2 floors. It's very exciting for Great Yarmouth and the area. I'll post a link in the chat if you'd like to subscribe to the mailing list and you haven't yet, and kind of do that terrible YouTube thing of hit subscribe, and then we'll be easier to find on YouTube in the future. But thank you once again, everyone, for tuning in and everyone who's involved in tonight. We are in the stream now.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Everyone, thank you on the chat. Sarah Mason saying, archiving a project perfect for a student on UEA's film, TV and media studies.
It's a professional job. I have to stand up for my profession. Thank you, Sarah.
You can look back at the chat afterwards for all the things from people. Okay.
Henry.
Yeah.
And Henry, can I just say, when Biddy and I were doing our piece, the reason I paused was because I couldn't see myself. I could just see Biddy all the time. So I don't know whether my head was
you
or
were visible.
whatever, because then I thought I wasn't visible.
I'll just stop the stream. But yeah, no, you were visible. Like we did. I think that's what happens in the.
Well, the thing, I couldn't see myself, so I thought, I don't know.